said he was a prince of God, a lion of war, a crusader chosen to purge the east of infidels. But when the gates closed and the screaming began, there was nothing holy in what followed. Women impaled on stakes, children tossed into fire pits. The blood in the gutters of Antioch ran so thick it turned black by morning. And through it all, he smiled, not like a savior, but like something older, something colder. Bohemond didn't carry the cross to redeem himself. He wore it to conquer, to burn cities in the name of salvation, to crown himself over a mountain of corpses. Some called him a hero of the First Crusade. But those who survived his campaigns, they called him beast, butcher, shadow crowned in silver. If Richard the Lionheart was the golden mask of the crusading age, Bohemond was the iron jaw beneath it, grinning wide as it devoured the east. And if Vlad the Impaler killed to terrify his enemies, Bohemond did it for power. One did it in the forest, the other in full daylight while praying over the dead he made. This is not a tale of faith. It's the anatomy of a man who turned a holy war into personal empire, a warlord baptized in steel. And if you think you know the Crusades, you've never met the Prince of Antioch. He was born of wolves, raised in exile, fed on betrayal, and the first time he killed, they say, he didn't blink. He was born of wolves, but unlike the beasts in fairy tales, these wolves didn't raise him to survive, they bred him to conquer. Sometime around 1050, in the blood-soaked hills of southern Italy, a child opened his eyes under a sky that had never known peace. His name was Mark, later renamed Bohemond after a giant from legend, because his own grandfather claimed the infant was too large, too monstrous to be human. That name stayed, and so did the shadow it cast. His father was Robert Guiscard, the Norman warlord who clawed his way from landless knight to Duke of Apulia, a man who spat in the face of popes and emperors alike. But Guiscard had many sons, and Bohemond was born not of a lawful queen, but of a discarded first wife. That meant no inheritance, no title, just the hunger. By the time Bohemond could walk, he was training with swords taller than his own body, not for ceremony, for war. His childhood castle, Melfi, was not a place of prayer or courtly manners, it was a forge. Outside its walls, Apulia was chaos. Peasants rebelled, Byzantines plotted revenge, and Sicilian warlords murdered each other before sunset. And inside those walls, a boy watched, not with innocence, but calculation. He saw the men who ruled, and more importantly, those who failed too. He listened when Guiscard cursed cowards. He studied when mercenaries returned from raids soaked in blood. And though he rarely spoke, when he did, it was said his voice carried the calm cruelty of someone who already understood death. As his father expanded the Norman grip across southern Italy and Sicily, Bohemond followed not as a prince, but as a shadow. Denied inheritance, he carved power out of absence. He led small raiding parties on his own by his late teens, striking faster and harsher than his commanders expected. A rival once claimed, Bohemond does not fight to win. He fights so the survivors never dare again. It was around this time that a strange rumor began to spread, that the young Norman didn't sleep after battle, that he stood outside his tent, barefoot in the bloodied earth, staring at the stars as if waiting for something darker to come. When Guiscard finally turned his army eastward against the Byzantine Empire, his most dangerous campaign yet, Bohemond was given a command, not out of love, but out of necessity. The boy had become too dangerous to leave idle. And if southern Italy had molded him, the East would soon awaken the monster fully. Because war was no longer coming, it was calling. They sent him east not to win, but to bleed. They thought the Byzantines would break him. Instead, he found something far worse than death: purpose. In 1081, Bohemond landed on the shores of the Balkans with his father's army, part of a Norman invasion aimed at tearing the Byzantine Empire apart. The Greeks called them barbarians, raiders, devils in mail, but Bohemond didn't raid, he dissected. While Guiscard laid siege to cities, Bohemond flanked through forests, cut supply lines, isolated garrisons, and left mutilated bodies where patrols would find them. It wasn't just war, it was performance. Messages written in entrails, fear as strategy. The Byzantine chronicler Anna Komnene, daughter of the emperor himself, later wrote that Bohemond was a thing not born of woman, but of war itself. She hated him, she also couldn't look away. While his father negotiated treaties and chased titles, Bohemond became something else entirely, a ghost in human flesh. He didn't sleep in tents. He rode with wolves at nightfall, alone, through enemy lines, appearing at dawn on the other side with blood on his sword and no explanation. His men didn't question it. Some whispered that he could smell fear. Others swore he could predict the future in dreams. What they all knew was this: if Bohemond was leading the charge, the enemy rarely had time to scream. In 1082, during the Battle of Dyrrhachium, he outmaneuvered a larger Byzantine force and scattered them like cattle. When the survivors regrouped, they found their dead stripped naked, crucified upside down, with crude symbols carved into their chests, Greek letters reversed and burned. No one could prove Bohemond ordered it, but no one doubted it either. That was his genius. He didn't just kill, he hollowed out the mind. And yet, even in triumph, his place remained uncertain. When Guiscard died in 1085, Bohemond's claims to Apulia were dismissed. His half-brother Roger inherited the title. Again, Bohemond was left with nothing: no land, no crown, just a name and the myth growing behind it. That's when he began to watch the East with different eyes, not as a battlefield, but as inheritance. Because far beyond the Adriatic, rumors were spreading of a holy war, of banners raised in the name of God, and Bohemond smelled opportunity, not for salvation, for empire. He missed his father's funeral, but not because of grief. Bohemond had no use for tombs. He was too busy carving his name into the living. By the late 1090s, Europe burned with frenzy. The Pope had declared a holy war, the First Crusade, a call to arms cloaked in salvation but soaked in vengeance. Knights, peasants, drunks, and zealots alike marched east toward Jerusalem. But Bohemond wasn't one of them, not at first. He watched, waited. He saw chaos, and in it he saw a vacuum. He didn't join the crusade out of piety. He never believed in the purity of war. What he believed in was vacancy, vacant thrones, vacant castles, vacant crowns. And the East, torn by infighting, famine, and fear, offered more thrones than prayers. When he finally raised his own army, it wasn't a band of pilgrims. It was a private militia, a machine. Veterans from his Balkan campaigns, Sicilian killers, mercenaries who spoke with blades, not vows. He marched not under the cross, but behind it. The journey east was not a march of faith, it was an autopsy. Peasants starved, nobles fought each other, whole cities refused them entry. When Bohemond passed through Dalmatia, he didn't preach. He negotiated at sword point, and when he reached Constantinople, the Emperor Alexios demanded oaths of loyalty. Bohemond smiled and swore, but the words meant nothing. To him, loyalty was a tool, a scabbard, something you wear when needed and throw aside when it cracks. On the march into Asia Minor, his reputation grew darker. His discipline was absolute. Desertion was punishable by mutilation, theft by blinding, but he protected his men like a beast guards its own den. In return, they followed him through heat, plague, ambush, and death. And when lesser leaders hesitated, Bohemond pushed forward, carving a path through Turkish lands like he was hunting ghosts. No prayer, no pause, only steel. Some say he cried out God's name before battle. Others say he whispered nothing, but always, always, he came back bloody and smiling. One captured Turk, before his beheading, asked if Bohemond was a man or a demon. The answer never came, but one thing was clear. He wasn't marching toward Jerusalem, not really. His eyes were already fixed on another city, a city of stone walls, golden towers, and a name that would one day define him: Antioch. It was God who opened the gates of Antioch. It was a knife in the dark and a promise soaked in betrayal. In October 1097, the Crusaders reached Antioch, a city of myth, gold, and stone walls so high they split the sky, but beneath the towers lay rot, disease, hunger, and fear. The siege dragged on for months. Rain turned fields into swamps. Men gnawed leather to survive. Some ate the dead. Others didn't wait for them to die. Crusaders began deserting. Nobles turned on each other. Priests lost their voices. And Bohemond, he thrived. He didn't curse the hunger. He embraced it, because desperation is a tool. And starving men are easier to mold than faithful ones. He started whispering, "If we take the city, I will rule it, not as a steward, not as a vassal, as a prince." It was a violation of his oath to Emperor Alexios. But Bohemond never respected paper. He respected power. So he began plotting, not just against the Saracens, but against his own allies. While others prayed for a miracle, Bohemond bought one. He bribed an Armenian guard named Firuz, promising riches and protection in exchange for a single act of treason: open the Tower of the Two Sisters under cover of night. On June 3, 1098, the gates opened. Not to trumpets, but to whispers. Bohemond's men stormed the walls like phantoms. The Turkish defenders were slaughtered in their beds, throats cut before they could scream. Streets became rivers. Men, women, children, none were spared. Blood dripped from balconies, and Bohemond stood at the heart of it, not as liberator, but as architect. The next morning, he announced it plainly: Antioch belonged to him. The other Crusader leaders protested. He didn't blink. He surrounded himself with loyalists, barred them from the citadel, and dared anyone to challenge his claim. No one did, not because they agreed, but because they feared him more than they feared damnation. It was here, amidst the ruins of saints and martyrs, that the mask of Crusader cracked. Bohemond was no longer a pilgrim. He was a prince, crowned not by God, but by the butchered silence of a city. And yet, this was not his end. Antioch was only the throne. What followed was the reign. He didn't build a throne in Antioch. He carved it from bones and dared anyone to sit beside him. Once the city fell, Bohemond didn't waste time with politics. He ruled like a warlord, not a prince. Streets still stank of rot when he began reshaping the city into a fortress of fear. Surviving Muslims were either enslaved or executed. Those who converted were watched. Those who resisted were flayed, crucified, or hung from towers as warnings. Byzantine emissaries arrived, demanding the city be handed over per his oath. Bohemond laughed, then sent them home with no gold, no terms, and no eyes. But ruling Antioch wasn't just brutality, it was chess. The region was fractured, Armenians, Greeks, Turks, rogue Crusaders, all clawing for scraps. Bohemond played them all. He made alliances that lasted hours, promises that ended in dungeons. If someone questioned his legitimacy, they vanished. If a priest spoke against him, they were found in the Orontes River, mouth stuffed with pages from scripture. And through it all, he maintained the illusion of sanctity. He funded churches, held masses, he even fasted in public, just enough to keep Rome confused. The people whispered of strange things, that Bohemond kept trophies. The teeth of executed lords, a jar of Turkish eyes. That he spoke to portraits in the dead of night. That he believed the crown of Antioch didn't belong to man, but to something older, something that had chosen him. Whether that was madness or myth didn't matter. What mattered was that fear worked. Crime vanished. Rebellions died before they began. His knights became loyal to the idea of him, not the man. And that's when he made his fatal move. He looked beyond the walls. Antioch wasn't enough. The East was still bleeding. The Byzantine Empire had survived, but Bohemond wasn't finished with it. He believed Alexios had betrayed the Crusade, that the emperor had sent them to die while hoarding power. But underneath that rage was hunger. Because if Antioch was a crown of blood, then Constantinople was a throne of gold, and Bohemond was ready to take it. He had survived starvation, betrayal, and siege, but when he marched on Constantinople, he met something even he couldn't devour, his own reflection. By 1107, Bohemond had crowned himself Prince of Antioch and transformed a holy war into a personal empire. But victory had soured into obsession. He believed Emperor Alexios Komnenos had betrayed the Crusaders, had abandoned them at Antioch to die like dogs. The truth was more complex, but Bohemond didn't want truth. He wanted vengeance, or perhaps, deep down, he wanted something more dangerous, recognition, from the only man he had never been able to break. So he returned to Europe, not to retire, but to recruit. He painted himself as a wronged Crusader, betrayed by the Greeks. He called for a second holy war, not against Islam, but against the very empire that had once crowned Christianity. And it worked. Nobles flocked to him. Gold poured in. The Pope himself blessed the campaign, but this wasn't a crusade. It was a vendetta dressed in silk. When Bohemond sailed to the Balkans with over 30,000 men, he expected another Dyrrhachium, another campaign of glory and mutilation. But this time the Byzantines were ready. Alexios didn't meet him on the battlefield. He starved him, harassed his supply lines, spread false rumors, stirred disease. Months dragged on, morale rotted. Bohemond grew thinner, quieter. Some claimed he talked to himself. Others whispered he'd stopped sleeping entirely, staring at maps for days without eating, eyes sunken like a man already embalmed. Finally, broken and humiliated, Bohemond was forced to kneel. In 1108, he signed the Treaty of Debolis, renouncing his claim to Antioch, swearing fealty to the very emperor he had sworn to destroy. It was the first time Bohemond bowed to anyone in his life. And even then, he didn't mean it. He returned to Apulia, shattered but still seething, no longer a prince, no longer a crusader, just a legend unraveling in silence. But monsters rarely go quietly, not men like him. Because even in defeat, he began to whisper again of new wars, darker visions, and the crown he still saw in dreams. He lost everything except the voice that told him he was still chosen. After the humiliation of Debolis, Bohemond returned to Italy not as a prince, but as a phantom. His body was deteriorating, bloated from sickness, ravaged by years of war and starvation, but his mind refused to rest. He locked himself in rooms for days, drew maps of campaigns that would never happen, held mock councils with no one present. Servants said he spoke aloud in broken Latin, not to God, but to a crown that wasn't there. His followers dwindled, his fortune drained. And yet he still plotted a final war against the East, a war that existed only in his head. He built nothing, left no dynasty. His wife, Constance of France, daughter of a king, tried to stabilize his name. But Bohemond didn't want stability, he wanted conquest. Even in sickness, he drafted letters to European courts, begging for armies he could no longer lead. Some replied with silence, others with pity, but none answered his call. Because by then, Bohemond wasn't feared, he was forgotten. In 1111, death came not with a blade, but with silence. No battlefield, no last charge, just a fading man in Canossa staring at a wall, as if still seeing the spires of Antioch through the fog of years. Some say he died with a smile, others say he died screaming, but none dispute what he left behind, a kingdom held together by fear, then shattered by time. Bohemond was buried like a prince, but remembered like a ghost. And centuries later, when historians searched for heroes of the First Crusade, they found saints, martyrs, and then they found him, a man who wore the cross like armor but wielded it like a curse, a warlord baptized in blood, a prince who turned a holy war into a throne of horror. He was never meant to be a king, but in the ruins of Antioch and in the nightmares of every city he touched, Bohemond of Taranto still rules, not in name, in silence. They called him a hero, a crusader, a prince of God. But peel back the hymns, the banners, the broken oaths, and what you'll find is a man who used faith like a blade, sharp, silent, and always pointed forward. Bohemond didn't fight for salvation, he fought to be feared. And when the gates of Antioch opened, so did something darker than any army he ever faced, himself. So if you still think the Crusades were stories of holy light, then maybe you haven't seen Richard the Lionheart drown in blood for glory. And maybe you haven't walked through the forests where Vlad the Impaler planted men like trees. This world doesn't just make monsters. Sometimes it crowns them, and the next will wear a crown you've never seen. Subscribe, stay close. The war isn't over.